Welcome everyone. This slideshow covers my overhaul of the fuel tank on my AC 2 litre, plus fabricating a new fuel pipe. Notice that I use the word fuel. Here's a fun fact from British motoring history. In the earliest days of motoring, the British used the term gasoline for the fuel. The word petrol was a brand name introduced by the company Carless, Capel and Leonard of London. They had been commissioned by the Daimler Company of Coventry to produce a fuel for their cars. As so often happens, this trade name became a generic word. The AC's tank is mounted fairly high up over the rear axle. This protects it from damage. I recall years ago seeing a neighbour rupture his fuel tank as he drove off in his Ford Sierra as fuel poured out the back. The AC tank has a bottom exit pipe, making it easy to drain. The tank is effectively a gravity feed, keeping some static pressure in the pipe, although there is a pump in the engine bay. It also means that any water separating in the tank will tend to collect in the glass bowl filter. A disadvantage is that the entire contents of the tank might leak out if the pipe or filter leaks. Later ACs had the filter mounted higher up. To reduce this danger, I plan to fit a cut-off valve. More of that later. My fuel tank was already out of the car as part of the full restoration. To remove it, you have to take out the rear seat and the trim fabric behind it, and also the trim on the rear shelf. That reveals the 6 mounting bolts. The boot lid and partition will also have to come out. Then remove the filler. Take out the 2 coach bolts at the top, then you can undo the front nuts and take the tank out via the boot. Like so much else on this AC, the tank was coated with bitumen. Removal reveals a coating of solder, which is also to be found coating the inside of the tank. This used to be standard practice on British cars, and it is quite effective at keeping rust at bay. Be careful not to create solder dust when removing the bitumen coating because of the lead content. Back in the 80s, when I ran this car, the fuel line kept blocking with what I assumed was rust. In fact, it was varnish deposited by the fuel while the car was laid up. I've read about tank repair kits that coat the inside with epoxy to salvage tanks with small leaks. There are plenty of tales of disaster where the internal coating came adrift. If a tank is perforated, I think the best solution is to have a new one made or find a good second-hand one. I found that POR15's cleaner degreaser, when used at its highest concentration, that's 3:1 of water to cleaner, it removes the old varnish deposit easily. I placed the outlet assembly into a tub of this cleaner and it came out as shiny brass. I poured some cleaner into the tank, along with some old bolts to rattle around, and taped over all the holes. No, I'm not dancing with a small robot. I'm shaking the tank to allow the bolts to dislodge any flaky rust. I left the tank to stand on each of its 6 sides for at least 20 minutes each. That gave each side a good soaking. I have a boroscope and took these photos of the inside after cleaning. There were a few patches of surface rust, but nothing to worry about. Then I phosphate treated the inside using POR15's metal prep. As before, I let it stand on each side, this time for at least half an hour for each. I also shook it around to try and get the fluid onto the 2 baffles. I wore goggles and rubber gloves while doing this. Only a tiny pile of rust flakes came out. I had been aware of a slight leak where the filler pipe is soldered onto the tank, as some paint I'd applied back in the 80s had wrinkled up. During the internal cleaning process, I could see clean fluid emerging from a pinhole in the solder at the joint. Fortunately, it was at the top of the pipe. I decided that attempting to resolder it might make matters worse, either by melting too much or not heating it enough. Needless to say, any kind of flame would be a disaster if any petrol fumes remain in the tank, but in my case the tank had been empty for 17 years and had now been cleaned out. To deal with the pinhole, I decided that the epoxy mastic paint that I planned to use should be more than enough, as it is very thick and heavily loaded with pigment. I'll keep an eye on that when it's back in service. The solder coating can be phosphated prior to painting. and I coated it with epoxy mastic and then 2-part polyurethane. I left the filler pipe without a top coat as I planned to flock spray it later. I stuck the old Hessian padding back on when the final coat of paint was applied. On the outlet pipe you can see the tubular gauze filter. There's a second very fine gauze inside, and parts of it had broken, leaving larger holes. I've heard of owners removing the entire gauze without problems, so I've left it unrepaired after cleaning. The fuel gauge sender unit mounts on the top. I cleaned it up and tested the coil. The pivot used to seize up whenever the car had been left standing for a few weeks or more, so I've applied some white lithium grease to the pivot ends on the outside, and we'll see if that helps. I made a new gasket for it from Viton rubber, which should resist modern fuel better than the old cork-based gaskets. Reinstalling the tank presents more problems than removal. Once you get the front 4 bolts, which are welded to the tank, to go into the mounting brackets, you should be able to tighten the nuts, drawing the tank fully in, as these bolts are quite long. The problem is that the Hessian padding makes it a tight fit into the aluminium mounting frame, and one of my mounting brackets broke away from the frame. These are only held on with tiny aluminium rivets, so it is best to struggle and persuade the tank to go fully in before tightening those 4 nuts. You know it's fully in when the 2 top bolt holes line up, ready for the 2 coach bolts. There are plywood packing pieces so that you can align the filler pipe with the hole in the body shell. I fitted 2 new red fibre washers to the outlet assembly, along with some liquid gasket sealant. Then I found it could not be screwed in as it snagged the damper subrame. The end of the elbow pipe was cut at an angle, so I filed it square and then it went in okay. The filler connection has a short rubber hose, similar in size to a modern coupler hose, at 76mm or 3 inches long. Inside diameter is 60mm. I found a supplier called Viper Performance, who stock hose specifically for fuel fillers, which has a much thinner wall plus a spiral wire reinforcement. This allows more flexing and maybe less stress on that soldered tank joint. As mentioned earlier, I decided to fit a fuel cut-off valve. I bought this competition style valve, making sure that it is large enough when opened for plenty of flow. It's a metal valve with a PTFE seal that should resist most types of fuel. It has 1/4 BSP threads which screwed straight onto the AC's elbow pipe. I bought an adapter so it can connect to the coupling nut on the main fuel pipe. And talking of the pipe, I made a new one. To install and remove the pipe you have to bend it, and I'd removed and refitted it back in the 1980s. Too much bending is likely to lead to a fracture, so I took the opportunity to upgrade the material and make a new pipe. The original was copper, 5/16 of an inch outside diameter. For the new pipe I purchased a copper-nickel alloy, which should cope better with being bent. I had to solder the fitting onto the rear end using plumber's solder and flux, after cleaning the metal with abrasive. I tested the solder joint for leaks in a very high-tech way. I attached a tyre pump to the other end of the pipe and placed the solder joint underwater with my finger over the end, and then pumped in air and checked for any bubbles. All was good. Fortunately, I checked that the 1/4 BSP compression nut for the other end would fit my fuel filter. It didn't. I know a little about screw threads, and the British-made Zenith filter uses a special thread. It's not British standard pipe, or the American equivalent. It does appear to use the Whitworth thread form. By that I mean the detailed shape of the thread, which has flanks at 55 degrees, and the root and crest have the same radius. That thread form is used for several thread series. The pitch of this particular thread is very fine at 24 threads per inch, so maybe they specified this to minimise leakage. The diameter is 1/2 inch, which is a tiny bit smaller than 1/4 BSP. Anyway, I reused the old compression nut along with a new olive. I threaded the new pipe into the left-hand chassis rail from the engine bay. It emerges under the rear seat. The original had quite tight bends at the rear end, and there was a slight kink which might have exacerbated the old fuel blockage troubles. I made the new pipe slightly longer so I could make a number of gentle curves to allow for fuel tank movement, despite the extra length added by the new shut-off valve. As you can see, there's a rubber pad to protect it from chafing. The original pipe clips for the chassis were the same awful things used on the brake pipes. They press into holes in the chassis but often jump out, as well as going rusty. So I made new brass P-clips and mounted them on rubber blocks. That gives more clearance for the wiring loom, which is larger on my car due to some extra wires. More bending to do at the front end. I did this by hand, but using scraps of larger pipe to wrap it around without accidentally putting in any tight bends. Also making sure it doesn't get close to the chassis edges. That just leaves the Zenith filter. You might have seen the AC Delco versions, which you can still buy, but this is a bit smaller. It also has a different design of filter inside, which is secured by a knurled nut underneath. They resemble a stack of flat washers and look less fragile than other types of filter. I soaked the entire unit in cleaner degreaser for a few days and it came out like new. Penetrating oil was needed to get the threads clean of gummy deposit. I made a Viton rubber seal for the glass bowl and a natural rubber mounting block for the filter to go onto the bulkhead. Back in the 80s I applied golden hermatite non-setting gasket sealant to the threads and to the fibre washers on all the fuel joints. Now I use Hylamar blue and hope it works just as well. You mustn't use plumber's PTFE tape for fuel line joints though. For the SU fuel pump I took the easy route and bought a new one with electronic contact breakers. This should be resistant to modern fuels, saving me the bother of renewing the diaphragm in the old pump. It's the low pressure version of the pump as it is mounted near the engine. The only trouble I had with the old one was when the car had been out of use and the British climate is damp enough to oxidise the contacts, so that's one small source of trouble eliminated. That's the fuel supply sorted. Now I just need an engine. I'm still awaiting the new crankshaft and the more recently ordered camshaft. It'll be easier to work on the engine when the weather warms up. That's all for now. Thanks for watching.